My name is Eliza Rylander, and this is a short preview of what I'll be covering in my presentation for John Drake's English 2 online class. In my presentation, I would like to dig deeper into the effects the European settlers had on the Native Americans who were already settled in what we know today as the Western United States. I will be highlighting who the Indians were before the settlers invaded and how they lived their lives, as well as how it all changed once the Europeans started moving west. The Native Americans were generally peaceful and spiritual people. They had very specific gender roles. The men were hunters and warriors as well as protectors of the group, whereas women tended to children, homes, and farmed. Natural foods were consumed, such as deer, buffalo, fish, and birds, which originally were hunted on foot before the Europeans introduced the horse. They also gathered corn, beans, squash, berries, nuts, and melons. The Plains Indians' main source of food was the buffalo. Because Indians tended not to be wasteful people, they generally used the entire animal once it was hunted. Besides eating the meat, tanned hides had multiple uses, such as being made into moccasins, robes, quivers, and teepee covers. Horns were used as spoons, ladles, and headdresses. Tails were used as decorations, fly brushes, and whips, while hooves were used as glue and rattles. The Native Americans are very resourceful people who made their own blankets and weaved their own baskets using the resources around them. The land in which they lived was very important to the Indians, and they were very grateful for what they had. They oftentimes tried to give back to the land by performing different ceremonies. Throughout the 1800s, the Indians struggled and fought battles in pursuit of protecting their land. The U.S. government passed various laws stating Indians should be removed. The U.S. government created many treaties with various Indian tribes. These Indians tried to work within the system, but the system often betrayed them by breaking all the treaties. Indians were herded into smaller and smaller barren pockets of land called reservations. In the mid-1800s, Indians were hopelessly outnumbered by whites. In 1873, whites were killing buffalo at an estimated rate of 3 million per year. Congress passed a law protecting the herds from extinction, but President Grant vetoed it. In 1875, prospectors discovered gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was the holy ground to the Sioux and an area that the U.S. government had promised the Sioux would be theirs forever. The European settlers slayed the buffalo in hopes of taking away the Indians' main source of food. They did not use the buffalo in any way, it was simply wasted. In hopes to fight against the Europeans and in order to keep their land, Sitting Bull led the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes into battles against the U.S. cavalry sent by General Sheridan. Indian chiefs such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse saw that the European settlers were trying to take away the Indians' freedom and land. The only reason that the Europeans wanted their land was for greedy reasons. They had no interest in living peacefully alongside the Indian groups that were already residing on these lands. Sitting Bull oftentimes found himself in isolation because he refused to adopt dependence on the white man. European settlers failed to understand the Indians' concept of maintaining hunting and fishing lands. To the Europeans, land that wasn't cultivated was wasted. To the Indians, even land that they sold was still theirs to hunt and fish. This led to many conflicts. Tension between the Native Americans and the European settlers resulted in a series of conflicts known as the Sioux Wars. Even though many agreed to relocate to ever-shrinking reservations, some resisted. One of the most important battles during the Sioux Wars was the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Colonel George Custer led his men into an Indian camp where he planned to annihilate all of the Indians, as well as capture hostages. The Indian camp in which George Custer rode into was Sitting Bull's camp. It was much larger than any of them had ever expected. 25 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were led by Sitting Bull and conquered Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry, which is made of about 210 of his men. The Indians then demanded retribution.
Indian reservations are how the U.S. government hoped to appease the Indians. Even on the reservations, the Indians were dying of diseases which the Europeans brought to the land. Syphilis, measles, bubonic plague, smallpox, or mumps are all diseases that the Indians had never encountered before, and it was wiping them out by the thousands. The Indians were forced off of their fertile land, faced with diseases, and introduced to alcohol, which created an epidemic throughout the Indian tribes. Alcoholism is not something that they had ever dealt with before, and it was sweeping their nation. Their main source of food, the buffalo, was also killed off, forcing them to live into the settlement schools which the European settlers had established. The Indians were to learn Christianity and to become civilized or Americanized. Many children endured abuse on these reservations. In addition to disregarding tribal languages and religions, schools often forced the pupils to dress like Eastern Americans. They were given shorter haircuts, and children were given Americanized names. Today, in current times, there are about 560 federally recognized Native American tribes in the U.S. Many face problems such as poverty, alcohol abuse, and heart disease. The European settlers completely altered the future of Native Americans back in the 1800s and are ultimately responsible for who they are today. Food supply was annihilated. Their land was taken from them. They were forced onto small reservations. They were introduced to disease and alcoholism. The European settlers had many negative effects on the Indians. As I continue my research and further create a larger presentation, I would like to dig deeper into the effects that the Europeans have had on the Indians and how it altered to the lifestyle and the people that they are today.